Some 450 million European citizens will be eligible to vote in elections to the EU Parliament later this year. With populist parties gaining ground in many member states, there are fears that a right-wing surge could threaten the unity of the bloc. Our Brussels bureau chief looks ahead.
Russia's war relentlessly raging on in Ukraine. Refugees and migrants desperately trying to reach the European continent. A presidential election in the United States that could end with Donald Trump back in the White House. Only a few of the many challenges the EU will face in 2024.
It's important that we have a strong European Union, especially in this new world where we have conflicts. We need to speak with one voice.
All over Europe, citizens are telling us that they want Europe to be more cohesive, a more social Europe.
I think the climate crisis is the biggest challenge we're facing.
We are here in the European Parliament where lawmakers are bracing themselves for a tumultuous year. They are all directly elected by EU citizens, and in 2024 those citizens head to the polls to decide on the future makeup of this parliament. Issues such as migration and a green transition are expected to dominate the campaign, with many here fearing that Europe's far-right populists could make gains in the election.
We know that the extreme right doesn't want to get into the climate, the green transition, but as well also that we see currently a backlash on women's rights, on minority rights, on human rights in general. And that is something that I find to be very, very scary.
I think that will also be the big battle. It's about liberal democracies versus autocracy and populism.
The EU doesn't shy away from battles, whether over its budget or the rule of law in member countries. Recently, Hungary vetoed the bloc's long-term financial aid for Ukraine. Will 2024 see Europe's unity wane when it comes to supporting Kiev? Not at all, says think tanker Jakob Kierkegaard. He believes that except for Hungary, EU members will stay united.
I think the realization among the political leadership, but also if you look at polling, I think Europeans understand that this is actually an existentially important fight for Europe.
But supporting Ukraine's fight for survival could get more difficult without an ally in the White House, should Donald Trump return as US president. He already threatened to quit the Western military alliance NATO in the past and now pledges to strike a deal with Russia, a prospect that has rattled Europe.
I think Europe has to take more responsibility for itself. We cannot continue to free ride is probably not the right word, but at least ultimately rely on an American security guarantee.
European politicians are getting ready for a year full of challenges. Challenges they hope the EU can overcome and maybe emerge even stronger than before.
Let's bring in Matteo Garavoglia. He's a research associate at the University of Oxford Center for International Studies. Matteo, good to see you. Except for the Hungarian leader Viktor Orbán, the European Union has been pretty united when it comes to supporting Ukraine. Could this change after the election?
No, I do think that what we'll have is still a significant degree of unity amongst European member states. This is because Europe's public, in terms of public opinion, Europeans understand that this is an existential issue that we're dealing with. The challenge, yes, is Viktor Orbán, it's Hungary, but things are already in motion to make sure that should Viktor Orbán veto further assistance to Ukraine, this assistance will still be delivered to Ukraine through other means, that is to say, outside the formal legal structures of the European Union, through an intergovernmental basis or bilateral basis. So whether or not Viktor Orbán wants Ukraine to continue to support Ukraine, Europeans will still be able to do that.
But pretty much across the board here in Europe, far-right parties are gaining in popularity. How do you expect this to affect results?
They keep gaining popularity. Yes, this is true to some extent, but I think this has to do partly because they had to change strategy, because they see that the old approach that nationalist or populist parties had, which was extremely confrontational against the European Union. They used to talk about, pulling out of the European Union in different member states. doesn't work. Recent surveys show that 3/4, almost 73%, almost 3/4 of Europeans think that membership of the European Union is beneficial for their country. And therefore, these right-wing nationalist political parties now are critical, offer different views, but they do not talk anymore about pulling out their member states from the European Union. And this is a success because they've been forced to change their own approach. They've also become better also at pitching themselves, so to speak. They have made themselves more electable, more, they got rid of some of their extreme vocabulary they used to employ. It does not mean that they will be able to get in key position of power within the European institutions, because the center-left, the Social Democrats, the European People's Party, the Conservatives, together with the Greens and the Liberals, they will still have a comfortable majority within the European Parliament, within the Council, and so they will be able to form some sort of grand coalition to keep extremist right-wing parties out of key positions.
All right. I'm sure there are more than some of our viewers breathing a sigh of relief there. We only have a short time, but I do want to get to this because when it comes to foreign affairs, the EU even now often struggles to speak with one voice. Where will a potential greater fragmentation, even with a, as you call it, more palatable far right, leave the EU's international credibility?
I think what we are going to see, but this is a little bit more medium term, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to shift away from unanimity, which is required at the moment, which means that all member states need to agree on foreign policy positions, to qualified majority vote in foreign affairs. This will make it impossible for just one or two member states to block all other member states from taking decisions together. And this is something that we will probably see within the next 5 years or so. So it has to do with how quickly Europe manages to pass this crucial reform, to shift from unanimity to qualified majority vote in foreign policy.
So plenty to unpack there. I'm joined now by Jan Techau, an international affairs expert from the Eurasia Group, who specializes in political risk research and consulting. Welcome, Jan. When we're looking at some of the most pressing issues facing the EU in the year to come, support for Ukraine obviously jumps to mind. How united is the EU on its support?
Well, the EU is still surprisingly united, actually, and it has been from the outset. When this war broke out in February of last year, the EU was pretty much united from the beginning, and until today that has held, with the exception of Mr. Orban, who's now standing in the way of another big aid package to Ukraine. But you can see from the other 26 European member states that they're absolutely determined to get that money to Ukraine. They're now looking for other tools, for other instruments in the EU instrument box to get that money to Ukraine, and it will eventually go to Ukraine. So you can see the determination that comes from the fact that most Europeans actually do believe that Ukraine's security has a lot to do with their own security, and that sense is still prevailing and very strong among EU member states.
Now, another trend worth paying attention to is that far-right parties are gaining in popularity across Europe. And when we're looking ahead to the European Union Parliament elections coming up, how could this trend affect results?
Well, I mean, it's quite clear that in the next European Parliament, after June of this year, the number of members of the European Parliament from populist parties, especially right-wing parties, will be much larger. But what we will not see is a populist majority in the European Parliament. The centre still holds, essentially, in the European Parliament, with the centrist, centre-left, centre-right parties, which have formed the de facto grand coalition in the European Parliament for quite some time, still retaining a majority. That's what the numbers and the trends tell us for today. But of course, it will be a much harsher parliament. There will be a harsher tone. It will be much more divided. And much of that center-right kind of agenda will actually creep into the mainstream. That will be one impact of much, much more members from that, political fringe entering into the parliament after the June elections.
And in addition to having some of the politics and policies of these groups creep into the mainstream, do you think it's likely that we would see, for example, far-right groups represented at higher levels in European politics than we have previously seen before?
I think in terms of the EU top jobs, that's very unlikely. Top jobs in the sense of the Commission President, the Council President, the High Representative for Foreign and Security and Defense Policy, those jobs are still off limits for the far right. What we will very likely see is a small number, perhaps 2 or 3, commissioners, members of the European Commission, coming into the new Commission as it will form in November of this year. Probably from Italy, very, very likely from Slovakia and perhaps a few other countries, maybe even the Netherlands. That's not entirely certain yet. So there will be representation at a fairly high level, but not at the top level yet. That's still off limits to the populists in Europe.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. That is Jan Techau with the Eurasia Group.